Larry is the branch chief for Conservation Planning Assistance in the Division of Habitat and Resource Conservation for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Larry began his career with the service in 1992 when he served as the Assistant Field Supervisor for the service's Northern Alaska Ecological Services Field Office in Fairbanks. His primary responsibility involving supervising the Conservation Planning Assistance Program, but also included general oversight of field office operations. Currently, Larry guides the Conservation Planning Assistance Program on a national level, helping to formulate service policy that facilitates both reasoned development and the conservation of service trust resources. That's really it in a nutshell, but you do so much more than that, and in addition to helping develop this team and this session. So I really appreciate all the work you guys have done in developing this. I've seen the email traffic going back and forth between all these people for the last couple months, and I'm really looking forward to this, and we'll see what we can do to fill up the room here by the end of the session.
Yeah, just use money. Okay, well, thanks, all of you, and thank you, Mike, and thanks for inviting us, actually. And we have tried quickly to pull some folks together to talk about the issue of renewable energy at the landscape level. And because it does, we've found that it takes a village with regard to renewable energy. It's across the landscape. It's big. It's coming at us at breakneck speed. So it's much bigger than just simply one agency. And that's why we have several folks here. And I'll just start right here on my right is Sarah Quinn with the National Park Service. And Sarah is the Renewable Energy Program Manager for the National Park Service at the Washington office level, but she's lucky enough to actually be located here in Denver. So, Sarah, thank you for joining us in this. And then next is Ashley Conrad Seda. And actually, all three of us, Ashley and Sarah and I, are on multiple conference calls, probably weekly, on some of these issues. So we work together on a lot of this. But Ashley's also the Renewable Energy Program Manager for BLM in California, and there are lots of projects in California, lots going on there. And then also, not sitting up front, but facing me is Gary Taylor. And Gary Taylor is with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and has been kind enough to come and join us and talk to us from his perspective from state agencies, the issues of renewable energy and placing those projects on the landscape. And Gary is the legislative director for AFWA based out of the Washington office, if I'm not mistaken. I believe that's correct, Gary, right? Out of Washington? Okay. And then last but not least, my comrade in arms, Bob Kurska, is on the far right over there. And Bob is in the Great Lakes Midwest region, Region 3 for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And he is also a program manager for the Conservation Planning Assistance Programs in Region 3. So actually, we were just talking about, and Mike was being kind when he was talking about everything that I do and responsible for. But it's really, essentially, I'm told what to do by folks like Bob out in the regions. So it's really not that difficult. So why we're here in this session really follows up the last one that was just in this room, where you heard actually a couple of excellent presentations on specific tools, landscape-level tools that can be used for renewable energy and other energy. And what we like to do is follow up on that, the group of us, and talk about some of those challenges, but also get all of you involved in talking to us about some ideas, sharing some ideas and talking about how we can actually maybe take some of these tools, some others, maybe some new ones, onto the next level. So again, I work with the Conservation Planning Assistance Program, a service program out of the Washington office, but it's field-based. Our business is primarily providing technical assistance to industries, states, agencies, and other partners for minimizing the impacts of development. And all of us are in that arena in one way or another. So we believe that it's time, the time is probably ripe to use a community approach to further development of some of these tools. Let's see if this works here. Okay. So the session objectives, really I just mentioned a little bit already that, I'm going to give just a little bit of perspective, not a whole lot. I think everybody has a lot of perspective already on this issue. But then the second objective here for our session is to explore opportunities, and that's going to be our focus. Most, if not all, of our organizations are already developing tools to assist in landscape scale assessment. And so what we'd like to do with all of you is share some of those ideas, collaborate on existing efforts, and to explore opportunities for joint development of either new tools or some of the existing tools like we've already heard about. So we want to save as much time as possible for the discussion. So I'm going to breeze through some of these slides just to make sure we're all on the same page here. Climate change, obviously a major driver here in renewable energy, why we're seeing such a push for renewables. And, it's an interesting thing for me. I guess I've been in this business for a while, but we talk about climate change and the dramatic impact that it's already having on our landscape and trying to predict that impact into the future, which is a critical thing that we need to be doing. But as well, I see human development infrastructure that is being placed on our landscape, in particularly in this area, energy, quickly, and it's something that's changing our landscape just as dramatically, and in some cases more dramatically. And it's actually something that we can have some effect on. We can, if we work together, all of us, we can have an effect on where that infrastructure ends up. So that's a big reason why the group of us are here. The part of the challenge is accelerating demand for renewables, which translates into a greater workload for agencies, states, and NGOs. And then also the time crunch and the pressures to develop mean agencies and organizations have little time to consider project-specific impacts, let alone the cumulative and landscape level effects of the growing renewable energy industry, something that we talked about earlier. So why? Why do we have accelerating demands? Well, clearly, and I think most of you know about this, President Obama's made it a top priority to create a viable renewable energy industry. He made that clear in the 2012 State of the Union address. A part of that is tax incentives. That has a lot to do with what's going on right now. He's instructed the Secretary of the Interior to set ambitious goals for producing renewable energy on public lands, 10,000 megawatts by the end of 2012, 11,000 megawatts by the end of 2013. And we're closing in on those goals, actually. Ashley and her agency, BLM, has taken the brunt of that. But we've all been involved in it, and we've all been working very hard with limited resources trying to do that as well as we can do it. But 29 commercial-scale projects have been approved since 2009, late 2009, including 16 first-of-their-kind solar commercial plants. And these are new beasts. These are large, some of them as large as 8,000 acres for a single project. So these are something very new, something that really all of us collectively really haven't dealt with before. But a number of other factors also involved. State renewable portfolio standards require electricity producers to generate or acquire a percentage of generation from renewable sources. They range from 10% by 2013, that's probably a tall order, in Vermont, to 30% by 2015 in New York. And also, due to improvements in technology, particular solar panels, the cost has drastically come down. Costs are decreasing and the economics of deploying improving. The result, more rapid development than before, and even greater need to avoid and minimize impacts. Workload. All of this relates to workload for all of us collectively. Workload for agencies, states, NGOs corresponds to the collective slope of this particular graph. And this is a relatively recent graph, 2012. We're seeing dramatic increases right now. We're right in the thick of it. But we expect that to continue for some time to come. As an example, in 2011, we saw a 27% increase in wind production over 2010. Agencies are seeing a steady rise in renewable-related work, anywhere from 25 to 30% annually. For example, the Fish and Wildlife Service field offices were actively involved in over 700 private land wind projects last year. And that's not including the priority projects out west. What are the impacts? What's the big deal? What are the impacts on fish and wildlife? Impacts are not particularly well documented. However, we are gaining information as these projects hit the ground. As well, the USGS was just recently asked to conduct a 3-year study on large-scale assessment of wind power-related impacts. What we do know, we know that poorly sited projects can have significant impacts on species. I think most of us know about the issues with raptors at Altamont. Other more recent wind projects in the West are taking upwards to 6 golden eagles a year. Some projects in Appalachia and the Midwest are recording high mortalities of bats, both listed and non-listed species. And again, I think most of us know that some of these populations are also under extreme stress from white nose syndrome. A solar project, Ashley knows about this, probably some of you know about this particular project in Southern California, currently is holding nearly 200 individuals, threatened desert tortoises, for eventual release or translocation. So there are a lot of specific issues related to species in specific sites, but also at a landscape level. Clearly, we need an effective and efficient means to assess a site's potential for impacts and to appropriately site facilities. On the back end, we also need to have in place protocols for effective monitoring of those projects and those sites, and also effective mitigation planning. So a quick word about cumulative effects. Again, we discussed that a bit in the last session. We're really still getting a handle on some of the individual impacts of projects and site-specific projects, species-specific. So cumulative and landscape level effects are even less known and much tougher to get a handle on. Just an example is the reducing eagle forage in the Southwest due to large-scale solar development and the impact on eagle populations. Also, and somewhat obviously in this slide, this is an old one. Actually, this is 2009. And actually, you probably can't see it from there, but I kind of chuckle. The number of wind projects on this is 36. And this is supposed to be a cumulative of look at projects on the landscape. We've gone way beyond that. Obviously, here, I think the spread of this infrastructure across the landscape holds the potential of impacting continental populations of migratory birds and bats, particularly if we're not careful about siting them. So the point about cumulative effects, agencies have little capacity to consider these issues. This goes well beyond our normal boundaries of responsibility. We need to work as a community to develop tools to assess the impacts of individual projects, but also to assess potential cumulative effects. These tools need to be efficient as well as effective if we are to facilitate the development of renewable energy in areas that avoid and minimize impacts. The result will be the promotion of conservation and the promotion of a sustainable renewable energy industry. And how do we do that? And that's why we're here today. How can we come together as a community and accomplish that? Can we take steps from here to actually start to see that happen? And that's why here by the end of the day, we would really like to get some steps on a piece of paper about exactly where we go from here. So plans and strategies, what we'd like to do right now, I'm going to say a couple of things about what we're doing in the Fish and Wildlife Service, but then give each of the panel members a little bit of time to talk about a couple of the ideas or a couple of the landscape tools that they're using or developing to give you a broader idea the array of tools that are being developed out there, and then from there go into a more thorough discussion about where we go from here. The Service Directorate, like others, recognized the need for better tools and strategies back in 2009, and this was directly linked to our strategy on climate change. And it resulted in a 2011 report called Tools and Approaches to Facilitate the Review of Renewable Energy. That report reviews energy projections, potential impacts to resources, workforce needs, and recommends tools for citing and assessing energy proposals. The recommendations also include a close collaboration with LCCs in the development of a web-based tool that draws upon existing resource data and provides developers and agencies with general predictions of impact. As we've heard, the Services Rocky Mountain region, Region 6, is developing a prototype called LEAP, Landscape Scale Energy Action Plan. The report also makes recommendations regarding the integration of data among state and federal agencies. So other agencies, many of you out there are familiar with the other agencies, groups, NGOs, have similar plans and are working on similar tools. So we're going to hear a few of those right now. And actually, what I'd like to do is start, oops, sorry here, that was a mistake. There we go. Okay. Oh, I'm way ahead here. Now we're back. Now we're back on track. I'd like to ask Gary to come up first with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and talk a little bit about this from your perspective, and then we'll go right down the line.
Thank you, Larry. And as Larry observed, I'm Legislative Director for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. I also have the Public Lands portfolio and the Energy Development and Transmission portfolio, among other responsibilities. But we do represent the collective perspectives of the state fish and wildlife agencies, and what I want to share with you today are just some observations to give you some context within which the state fish and wildlife agency directors view and deal with the whole issue of energy development and energy transmission, which are inseparable in my mind. Every time you consider development, you have to consider transmission, because often the footprint of transmission is larger than it is of development, and all this energy that we're seeking to develop has to get somehow to the grid, and so you've got to lay the extension cord down there. So let me start off by just observing what you likely already know, that states have broad trustee authority and responsibility for conservation of fish and wildlife within their borders, including on most federal lands, and even where Congress has given the federal agencies certain conservation responsibilities, such as for migratory birds and listed threatened and endangered species. Congress has affirmed that the state's authority remains concurrent with federal authority over those particular species. So it's critical that we work closely together to meet conservation objectives for our citizens. As you all know, and as Larry observed, energy development and transmission have the potential to significantly affect the conservation of fish, wildlife, and their habitats on a landscape level. Just a couple of observations. The largest energy source footprint is biofuels, and the smallest is nuclear. But there are other issues with respect to both of those, for example. Which suggests, and we all know again, that all forms of energy development have impacts on fish, wildlife, and their habitats. As I observed, you really can't separate development from transmission, even though they are different industries that bring the development and those that bring the transmission. We need to consider both of them at the same time, and they all need to be at the table at the same time. State Fish and Wildlife Agency directors understand and support the need to enhance our nation's energy security through a thorough development of our domestic energy sources, but they believe it must be done in ways that avoid, minimize, or mitigate impacts to fish, wildlife, and their habitats, and also recreational uses such as hunting and fishing of those fish and wildlife resources. Just a little bit on energy transmission issues. For the last several years, we've been encouraging our state fish and wildlife directors to get to know their public utility commission, or in some states it's called their regulatory utility commission, because in most states, that is the state government entity that licenses the development of transmission corridors, and not a lot. If there's only one state that I'm aware of that has the opportunity to condition transmission corridors. So the reality is, while most of our states have no state statutory authority to condition transmission lines, by getting to know their public utility commission or regulatory utility commission, they can hopefully be a source of good information to them, so that when the PUCs are making decisions on transmission development, they'll have the best information available with respect to impacts on fish, wildlife, and their habitats. And that's essentially how we can achieve this necessary balance between energy development, transmission, and conservation of fish, wildlife, and their habitats, and that is to bring the state and federal agencies along with the development industry of both energy and transmission together at the earliest opportunity to share the best available information with respect to not just plans for siting and delivery of energy, but also where are the sensitive habitats, where are the migration corridors, where are the crucial populations of fish and wildlife resources. And that's where LCCs can help best inform those decisions, by bringing to the state and federal agencies the best science and information that is available on potential impacts of energy development and transmission on fish, wildlife, and their habitats. And as I'm sure you all are aware, states are already developing decision support systems that are regionally based, particularly here in the West, under the aegis of the Western Governors Association. The states out here are developing the crucial habitat assessment tool, which allows decision makers, governors, to look across the range of a species and better understand the impact of a decision that they may be making in their state on the range-wide effects on a species or the range-wide sustainability of habitat for a species. There are other similar cooperative efforts east of the Mississippi River. They're not under the aegis of a regional governors association, but the Northeast states are doing something comparable with respect to shared decision support tools, and I believe there's a nascent effort going on in the southeastern states. So with that, I just wanted to share with you some perspectives on what the State Fish and Wildlife Agency's perspectives are, and vital interest in the development and delivery of energy, renewable and traditional. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ashley Conrad-Seda, Renewable Energy Program Manager for California, but also here representing our national solar program. I'm doing some work for them on resource impacts of solar across the West as well. So we, in California, we have a lot of the 29 projects that Larry mentioned. We're working feverishly to permit projects at the same time that we're actually trying to be proactive about planning, developing tools, and better siting the next projects in the pipeline. And all of us, amongst all of the agencies working on this, it's not just BLM. We have very close partners in all the DOI agencies, the state agencies, including the Public Utilities Commission, and Kevin Hunting, who was here yesterday from Fish and Game, his staff. We're all working to remember that we're making history today and to try to not leave a legacy of broken mirrors. So we're trying to think about how we can actually move forward and look back and say we did something appropriate. We were able to switch power to a more reliable, sustainable source, but at the same time we maintained our conservation goals among all of our agencies. So some of the tools we're working on right now are massive landscape plans. We're looking at the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan in Southern California and a Renewable Development Energy Plan in Arizona. And both of those plans look not only at public lands, but also at private lands and ways to partner across ownership. And also to think about how you can allocate areas for reserve design as well as allocating areas for development, so that we're not just trying to develop in a bubble without considering all of those needs for offset and for avoidance and minimization. And we're also wrapping transmission into that planning. I think we started with thinking about the projects themselves, knowing that we had to permit generation interconnects, additional substations, longer haul transmission lines, but kind of leaving that to the utilities. So through these larger landscape plans, we're wrapping them into the process and including them in figuring out what the type of acreage impacts are associated with a given megawatt or a given 1,000 megawatts, like the large project that Larry was talking about. We've also learned that the rapid permitting that happened in 2009 and 2010 allowed us to learn a lot. So we're trying to take those lessons forward and develop more tools. We're using the assessment, inventory, and monitoring strategy, which is being discussed in Room B right now, to try to do monitoring across all BLM-managed lands, but also to partner with, again, state agencies, counties, other federal agencies, so that we're not just looking at BLM lands and doing this before-after control impact assessment. We want to look across all of those lands and have a much better sense of how energy as a development impact has a cumulative impact on all these other things that we care about. And setting it in the right context, because as Larry mentioned, there are additional development pressures, and we don't want to attribute everything to renewables. So we need to tease out the impacts that are directly coming from these projects, and through long-term monitoring, we can do that. We've also funded a lot of long-term habitat and behavior surveys across BLM. And we're doing that, and what I mean is tagging golden eagles over a matter of years and watching where they go, monitoring nests, installing cameras to actually monitor nest activity. We're doing tons of desert tortoise studies. We do have the nursery at the Ivanpah site. Some animals were actually translocated on the 25th, but we basically got 75 hatchlings because they were all in captivity. And not that many hatchlings would survive, but they're being fed a nice diet of organic produce from Whole Foods and are doing very well. So we have a problem. We don't want more hatchlings this year. And I'm sure you all know desert tortoise can hold on to sperm for a long time and choose when they want to actually produce a new hatchling. So we think that because they're doing so well, we will see another year of good productivity this year, and that's causing some problems. So we're doing a lot of habitat surveys to figure out where we can translocate these massive numbers of new tortoises. So those types of that type of information will be useful for years to come, we hope. And developers have told us that they can't afford to necessarily do these long-term longitudinal studies that cover not only their sites but adjacent sites that would be useful for us in making decisions. So we've said, okay, we'll foot the bill and do some of these surveys and hopefully help us come up with better siting tools. We're also partnering with DOE to do a lot of their environmental siting tools. The Department of Energy. And they've moved a little bit away from environmental siting assessments, but are still really interested in coming up with tools that will help them reduce the overall cost of energy. The solar program has a goal of $1 per watt, which right now siting alone takes up about 96 cents of that dollar per watt. So we've got a long way to go and a lot of collaboration. I'm hoping that through the LCCs we might have some databases that we can feed into, places where we can put our information, and then hopefully we'll just continue with partnering, not only through sharing funding needs, but also brain power. We can't do it alone.
Hi again, I'm Sarah Quinn with the National Park Service. And the Park Service isn't permitting renewable energy projects at the scale that we're talking about. We do little things like put PV panels on the top of a new visitor center, but we found that permitting large-scale renewable energy projects isn't an appropriate use of park lands. And so what we're doing is we're engaging with other local, state, county, and federal agencies and entities about their permitting processes, particularly when those projects, which can be multiple square miles in footprint, are in the proximity of national parks and have the potential to cause cross-boundary impacts to national park units. So the director of the National Park Service recently said that climate change is the biggest challenge for national park units, and the Park Service, of course, very much supports the development of green energy and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in moving forward with a new energy universe for the sorry, distracted, for a new energy universe. But at this time, what we really need is we really need to better understand the siting, design, minimization, and potential mitigation of these projects at the landscape level, so we make sure that in the future, looking back, as Ashley alluded to, we have the right system in place. For example, hydropower is a type of renewable energy, and most people, I think, at this conference wouldn't be jumping up and saying, yay, more dams on rivers. But once upon a time, that was the answer. And we want to make sure we don't have a repeat of some of the hydropower boom that we had in the United States, which can be done appropriately in small doses, but needs to be done with a mix of other types of appropriate design mechanisms. So what the Park Service is doing right now is looking at the lands outside park units that need to be protected in order to have cross-boundary impacts. I think most people in this room are very familiar with the concept of island biogeography and the challenges that park units faced in management of the resources that they're charged with protecting. Most of the boundaries of national parks are somewhat arbitrary in the sense that they're a nice jurisdictional line that's created because of an existing road or a county line, or some of the older parks are just square. And they have nothing to do with the ecotones and the watersheds and the ridges that actually make a park system work. And so what we're looking at is doing GIS analysis on BLM lands, on county lands, on Forest Service lands, and pulling that information together so we can help identify which areas around parks are appropriate places for development, because we can't have a bubble around parks. We don't get to have a jurisdictional buffer. It's not legal, it's not feasible, but we can help in this process in saying, go here, please don't go here, and identifying those areas not only for conservation, those priority areas, particularly for things like desert tortoise habitat, where desert tortoises don't understand jurisdictional boundaries, and that there's a need to protect those external resources to the parks on other federal, county, state, private lands in order to make sure that the park resources are maintained in perpetuity for the American public and for their own sake. So that's where we're at right now, and those are the tools. For the BLM's programmatic solar EIS, which we were a cooperating agency on, we did a geospatial analysis of the resources for 25 miles out of the boundaries of all 53 park units within the solar PEIS area. But there's a limitation to the work that we've done so far. The limitation is this. Because renewable energy is happening at such a rapid pace, we look at the situation on the ground today, and we make decisions about siting and make decisions about lands to set aside for mitigation. And what we haven't gotten to yet is looking at that information and then using some of the tools that are being developed by and utilized by the LCCs and all the LCC partners and even the Park Service itself. We haven't caught up to incorporating that climate change information, to looking at the vulnerability assessments and the scenario planning to say, okay, if we put a project here today, it looks like a good spot today. Is it really a good spot 10 years from now? Is it really a good spot 50 years from now? Or if we choose these mitigation lands today to mitigate for a wildlife species impact, for example, is those mitigation lands, are they going to be appropriate for the mitigation of that species 50 years from now? Because that's the point. And so we could be choosing lands that really aren't going to serve their purpose in 10, 20, 50 years. And so those are the tools that we need from the LCCs, from our partners, and even internally within the Park Service, but we don't have the full capacity to do this on the hundreds of projects surrounding all of our parks nationwide to better understand those impacts and make sure that the Park Service units are protected and part of a larger landscape conservation system that is resilient to the impacts not only of climate change, but the impacts of these landscape level projects like a large-scale renewable energy. Thanks.
Okay, Bob, come on up here. Okay, Bob's gonna take us through the rest of this. I think we'll move on past the questions, go right into, if you have questions, be sure and you can ask them. This slide was meant to remind everyone that we've got other energy pressing us as well, but here are the questions that we thought would help guide us. And again, we want your input. We want to have some discussion about where to go from here, and Bob's going to facilitate that. Thank you, Bob.
Yep. Thank you, Larry. Thanks, folks. Excellent overview of the different agencies' perspective. Gary, the state's perspective. We thought it was really important that although this session, in talking with Mike and Rick Nelson and Craig Zarnicki and some others, was started by the Fish and Wildlife Service, we wanted to be very clear that the Fish and Wildlife Service is not the only agency that's dealing with this issue. I mean, all of us who are involved with conservation are having to deal with the impacts of renewable energy. Yesterday during the plenary session, Paul Schmidt indicated that one of the purposes of LCCs is to, I believe he said, document the changes on the landscape resulting from conservation actions. Well, I think that goes beyond that to climate change, but I would also argue that we need to expand that to renewable energy. You know, as Larry pointed out at the very beginning, climate change is with us right now. It's going to accelerate potentially, depending on different scenarios, into the future. But right today, right now, the landscape is changing right in front of our noses with renewable energy popping up. And that's not to say that non-renewable energy isn't going on too. This is all happening here. And so what we would like to do is to have a conversation amongst ourselves here in the room, recognizing we don't speak for the universe of the LCCs, but what we'd like to do is just sort of get a start of a conversation about potentially the role of the LCCs. I know several of the speakers have referenced what we believe to be a real need for the LCCs to actively, and not just sit back, but to actively engage in helping us to address some of these landscape scale changes that are going on right in front of us. But what we'd like to do is bring it to the LCC folks and see what you guys think about this collectively and how can we engage. So, you know, obviously the needs are urgent. We need to deal with this immediately. There are a number of actions underway by the states, the Western governors, efforts in the East, different agencies are developing tools, but I think something we've noticed and was documented, I don't think we ever showed this document, this landscape tools document Fish and Wildlife Service put together, which I believe, Larry, is available on the web.
It's on their thumb drive.
It's on the thumb drive. Perfect. Even better. Even better.
So you do have it. If you have that thumb drive, it's on.
But we recognize the need for the LCCs to engage. So what we would like to do is just have a conversation and maybe spend a few minutes on each of these questions, recognizing we're not going to be able to get into any depth on any of these. But I think where we would really like to end up and have some clear direction is this last question. What are the next steps? How do we proceed to build and foster that working relationship between LCCs and the resource agencies that are having to address the impacts, site-specifically, but really significantly, the cumulative effects of these things? So that's kind of the gist of the next 20, 25 minutes or so, and maybe we can just start right down the line here, and we don't have to force the conversation here for any particular questions, but just to start, do you folks see from your different perspectives that the concerns that have been expressed, like in LEAP and in sagebrush territory with the LEAP effort, some of the things with the PEIS going on, do you see those kinds of concerns popping up all over the country, or is this unique? I know that's kind of a basic question, but what's your sense of that? I mean, is this an issue that is all over the place?
I'm going to jump in just
Yeah.
real quick.
You bet.
An example that I think is unique because your last slide showed the oil well, and there's this huge oil play going on in eastern Montana, western North Dakota, southern prairie provinces of Canada, and there's no energy up there to allow the drillers to go at the speed they want. So now they're proposing thousands and thousands of wind turbines in the area to fund and provide the energy for the oil development. If that isn't ironic enough, that's a unique example, but I'm really glad you talked about the transmission piece, because that is something I think that's universal. Everybody's trying to get their arms around this transmission question associated with this big push for renewables, and hopefully that is something the LCCs can assist with trying to address and help fill those uncertainties associated with that new transmission push.
Well, I think we'll move on beyond the first question. I think it would probably be a fair assumption that, in fact, yes, the mix of renewable energy is probably, well, not probably, it is different from different parts of the country, from non-federal hydro to federal hydro out in the West. Hydrokinetic is really big along some of the coasts. We're seeing it in the Mississippi River, Missouri River, Ohio River. A lot of projects are proposed, and these are literally thousands of these units in a single project that are being proposed on the beds of these major river systems. We've got wind, we've got solar, geothermal, all of these things. So the mix is different from different parts of the country, but the stresses on our ecosystems are pretty much the common thread there. So moving on to the second question, we've already got a start. The session that preceded this one had a couple ideas. Certainly the LEAP is one tool that's being developed. And as just sort of a further lead-in, what we're seeing is very good reasons for development of these sort of regional or more site-specific tools. That's absolutely great, but I think what we're missing is an overarching framework, a national consistency to recognize renewable energy has to be put into a large landscape context. We can't just piecemeal it. So what we like to do is to come up with that kind of a framework from which these different tools can tear off or at least feed into this larger scale here. So obviously we can't go into a detailed conversation and listing of all the different tools that are out there, but I think we're all aware of some tools. And what ideas do you folks have beyond what we've already talked about this morning, or your awareness of tools that are being developed to deal with the risk assessment to resources from renewable energy development or impact assessment tools, those kinds of things? Are you folks aware of some other ones that haven't been mentioned so far? Just to kind of prime the pump. Yes? Susan, did you get the essence of that? Perfect. Any other?
Can you rephrase that? Did everybody hear that? You guys hear that?
Yeah, if you didn't, then I'm sure Bob would be happy to repeat it. Did everyone know?
Great. Any other ideas from your part of the country where you come from?
Yeah, there's lots of stuff going on in our agency, in Fish and Wildlife Service, we're attempting to use habitat conservation plans in Region 3, by the way, to try and streamline and bring some of the review and assessment of these projects to a landscape level. Is that the right way to go? I'm not real sure. It's kind of species specific, so it's maybe not as much of the large picture as what folks are doing with LEAP. Other kind of tools.
Well, let me follow up on that, Larry. Those HCPs that you discussed, those do integrate, Bob, if I'm correct, a risk management piece into the examination of the issue with the species.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know, Indiana bats are being impacted by wind projects. No big surprise there, but also a lot of non-listed bats are being impacted in very high numbers, in fact, proportionally much higher than migratory birds in many cases. So the Fish and Wildlife Service in the Midwest region got a grant to develop a multi-state, multi-species habitat conservation plan. It's underway now for about a year, working very closely with industry. States are sort of in the driver's seat to a large extent for that project. But as Larry pointed out, it is species driven, and that's because it comes back to the regulatory aspects of this listed species. I think many of us who are working in renewable energy probably share the frustration that the regulatory framework for renewable energy is a hodgepodge. Maybe out in the West it's a little stricter, but when you get to the East, each state has its own regulatory process for wind projects, for example. Some states don't even regulate wind. It comes down to, in some cases, to a county level. So while on the one hand we're trying to deal with multi-species ecological effects, how do you feed that into a framework? It almost has to be customized state by state, which is another level of complexity for those of us who are having to review these projects. Yeah?
I'll just add one more. The Mojave Parks, and just the Mojave Desert in general, has a study that was just published recently by the Sonoran Institute on the major desert habitat then where do we expect changes to occur potentially from climate change, and then identify what the highest priority areas within those high priority connectivity linkages are for, acquisition or other types of conservation easements or other actions, or if they're federal lands, potentially retiring them from, development. So that's the next step. I think the difficulty again is, the study was on a grant, it's been completed, and so there's the issue of, who takes it from here? Who takes it from here and takes it to the next level?
Excellent question. Excellent question.
Yeah, I would say, I think that's exactly the question. And the Solar PEIS is giving us an opportunity to look at some of these questions at a broader level. This is the solar programmatic environmental.
Can you guys hear back there? Right?
So we're looking at 17 potential zones for development across 6 states, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, Nevada, California, New Mexico. And we've got those 17 zones, and so we have an opportunity to take each of those zones, put them in a regional setting, or put sideboards on, where we're looking at them more cumulatively, not just at the BLM lands, and coming up with mitigation plans. So how much do we, in siting the zones, do we already avoid some of the impacts we're trying to avoid? What else can we minimize inside the zones, and then what's left for us to offset? And where can we offset some of those impacts? So we've got a mitigation piece, but we also have a monitoring piece, because we want to be able to, over time, again, look at the changes to the landscape based on putting these projects and transmission pieces in. And I think, like Sarah's saying, we can put this into the PEIS as a framework, but the next step is getting a group together and with a contractor on board, and BLM would potentially fund all of the contract, but to actually come up with, take these framework mitigation, framework monitoring plans, pilot them on a couple of zones where, again, we need a lot of partners for the pilot, take the data from that, analyze the data, adaptively manage those monitoring and mitigation plans, and spin them out, again, not only for the zones, but potentially beyond that. So I think the utility goes beyond states with solar potential to states where there's interest in wind or other types of developments. But we need partners to do that, and maybe you hear some frustration in my voice, but I'm trying to codify this language and put it into writing to go into our administrative final in the next few weeks, and then it kind of goes into a board. And we need people to jump in and say, you want to work on that?
You bet.
We need the LCCs to say, hey, I've got a database where you can put your data.
Well, we've got 10 minutes left.
Okay.
So we want to get to, this is all great discussion, and Mike, I'll hand it off to you for a comment, but what I'd like to do is move on now to the last 2 questions here in the time remaining.
Well, I was going to ask Gary a follow-up to a comment you made earlier about one state successfully finding a way to involve themselves in placement at the Public Utilities Commission level. And was that done as a result of better information? I mean, was there a piece to allowing that state to take that approach?
No, it was state law. I mean, it wasn't specific to energy development. It was specific to land use activities over a certain acreage. So there was not a direct nexus to that, but the state had an opportunity to comment and condition on land use activities over a certain size. It was one of the northeastern states.
Well, Ashley brought up I can't remember how many times you said partnership in your last dialogue there, and that's what this is all about. And I'd like to pursue that a little bit for you folks who are steeped in LCCs, I assume. What I think we'd like to talk about for a couple of minutes is what can the LCC bring to the table to help address renewable energy, and what you see as some of the positive things. I mean, we've kind of seeded it with our perspective of what LCCs can bring. What's your perspective? What are maybe some of the challenges that might stand in the way of that? Competing priorities, whatever the case may be, and then like to get to the action steps. Yes, sir.
statewide plan they're talking
Great observations. Thanks, Dave. Yep.
Hey, Bart Milton with the National Parks Conservation Association. There was David Hayes' remarks yesterday really centered around this idea of stovepiping and having a conversation about renewables and the opportunity for LCCs. Thanks. Having a conversation about renewables and the opportunities for LCCs to engage in that process and serve a coordinating role, I think, is really valuable. But I hate to see a stovepipe sort of get set up in relation to non-renewables, because I think the best practices between dealing with both probably are across the board, and there should be a conversation. I would urge you to have a conversation blending the two and thinking about the way to engage partners, deal with the companies involved, and deal with the agencies all in the same sort of as a standard practice rather than sort of two different conversations. I think they're one and the same in a lot of ways.
That's a fantastic point. And I mean, we're talking obviously about renewable energy, and where we jumped off to this conversation was this tools document that came out of the Fish and Wildlife Service's Climate Change Strategic Plan that referenced LCCs and helping with that. But obviously, what we're talking about here, renewable energy is infrastructure development. Non-renewable energy is infrastructure development. We've got highways, we've got expanding urban areas, we've got all kinds of things going on here. We can't necessarily pick and choose. I mean, we're starting with this, and I think a lot of what came out of the LEAP is the LEAP tool may have application way beyond energy, for sure. So I think the challenge for us is how can we look holistically with not get so consumed and weighted down that we just sort of implode because of the complexities of all of these things. I mean, that's going to be a challenge. We've only got a few minutes left, and maybe, Mike, I'll look to you for some guidance from an LCC perspective. I mean, where do we go? We've got this need. I'm aware of some of the organizational elements of the LCCs. I know that the LCCs have fairly regular conversations amongst themselves, national calls. There's a national effort. Where do you think we go with this issue to get it on the table for consideration? Because obviously we don't necessarily have all the decision makers to take this to the next step, but where do you suggest we go with this?
That's a great question, Bob. And one idea is that nationally we're trying to sew this 22 LCC network together as best we can, but this seems to be an issue that certainly is national in scope and should be addressed from a comprehensive look. And one of the things that we've done is try to identify topics and themes and work groups that should be worked on across the 22 LCCs. We don't have one now that looks at energy or renewable energy issues, and I think that this is probably, as you suggest, should be renewable and non-renewable. It doesn't do us any good to maybe separate the two out. I think that we owe it to the issue to try and address it from a national perspective. We should set up an energy subcommittee out of the LCCs to try and begin to tackle this a little bit. I think that might be helpful, but I'll turn it over to Sarah for an idea too, if you've got some ideas. The thing to remember from almost all of the LCCs, what we're trying to get to when we invest money in research is identification of that management relevant question that states, the feds, the non-governmental partners need addressed. So when we're talking about something as huge as this, try to bring it back to that management relevant question that's going to allow that land or water manager to make a better decision once these uncertainties are narrowed. And that's really the difficulty. So I think that's the charge for this eventual subgroup, the charge for your team as well.
I have a couple of brief points, and I guess I'm talking to everyone, but also maybe an audience of one from someone from the LCCs to bring this back, which is, I'm kind of charging the LCCs a bit with really thinking about going forward with this task for a couple of reasons. One is that it doesn't make sense, and we heard this in a lot of presentations, to go forward and do all your work and identify your priority conservation areas and ignore the development pressures coming in. If you're identifying priority conservation areas and you're not paying attention to the fact that those areas are being identified for development by other entities, then you're spinning your wheels. You're losing time. And so that would be number one. Number two is that a lot of these projects have a required mitigation. And the mitigation can come in all sorts of forms. And we're working to better the mitigation process and to improve how mitigation lands are identified and acquired and monitored in the long term. But many of us realize that there's a storied history with many agencies of identifying mitigation and having companies go out and just buy crappy pieces of land that don't mitigate the impacts. And so if you have 8,000 acre projects with required mitigation at a 3-to-1 ratio, the LCC should be jumping on that, saying here's the perfect opportunity where they have to do a huge mitigation piece. And you can help make that happen and make it happen in a great way, because it has to occur. We have to identify those lands, so be a partner in making that happen, because someone's going to make it happen, and if they don't have the right tools, then they're going to buy crappy pieces of land, and it's not going to accomplish anything, and it's not going to meet your objectives. So
we need to close down.
Yep.
Understand, Mike? What I would propose, and thanks for those comments, absolutely true. Mike, I guess I would look to you to maybe work with us, our little team here, to take this to the next step. And perhaps what we need to do is get on an agenda of one of those national calls, or whatever you see for us to assist to get this on the national conversation among the LCC leadership, to see where it goes. Because I think we all agree we got to work with our local LCC folks, but I think what we're talking about here, at least in terms of renewable energy, and I know that's just a tiny focus, but just talking about renewable energy, we can't do it LCC by LCC. How can we get a greater bang for effort working across the LCC lines? I think that's kind of the step that we're talking about here. So maybe the action item is, Mike, we'll follow your lead and we'll be a resource for you to help carry this to the next step to the LCC leadership and see where that takes us.
Well, I want to thank Larry and Bob and Sarah, Ashley, Gary for the hour. I think this has been very helpful. I encourage folks to talk to you throughout the day. Most of you are going to be around, I know, for the duration here. So thanks again for